We continue our study of Genesis, and we are in Genesis chapter 12. And if you recall, last week we ended our study by looking at the promise that was made by the Lord to Abram. And notice that the Lord said, or the Lord had said to Abram. He had made this promise to Abram before the events that are described in chapter 12. In other words, Abram already had a relationship with the Lord prior to what we read about here. And if you recall, we made the point that Terah, Abram's father, was an idolater. And so Abram had to learn about the one true God and the worship of the one true God from some place. And it is my conviction, even though I can't prove it, it's my conviction that the aged Noah taught Abram the truth. Because if you do the calculations, I think you will see that Noah, after the flood, was living in the same area with Abram for about 20 to 50 years approximate. And so I would think, myself, that Noah would have had impact and influence on Abram. At any rate, we see that the promise is made, and that the entire story of the redemption of mankind can be organized around what God tells Noah, or God tells Abram. I got Noah on my mind. What God tells Abram. And so, verse 4 tells us, so Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. First mention of Lot. Lot is Abram's nephew, and he will factor prominently in the chapters to come, in the story that we will read concerning Abram. And notice that he went, Abram did, as the Lord had spoken. Just as the Lord told him to do, Abram obeyed. And that's what the Hebrews writer points out. By faith, Abraham, when he was told by the Lord to go to a place which he should have to receive for an inheritance, obeyed. And he that goes on to say he went out not knowing where he was going. He didn't know where he was headed. And yet the Lord told him to do it, and he did it. And so it says, now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now at this stage in the book of Genesis, we're introduced to the concept that when you reach in the 70-year-old to 75-year-old range, you're beginning to be considered old. Now before this, we've seen men living hundreds and hundreds of years, even some as much as 900 and 950 to even 969 years. And now that we come down to Abram's day, it begins to be evident that when you are upwards of 70, 75, 80, that's considered by society to be aged. Interesting how quickly that changed. And I think, as our friends at Apologetics Press points out, that it had something to do with the changed climate of the earth after the flood, because the ultraviolet rays being able to age individuals more rapidly than if you would have a filter, such as would be the case if you had a canopy of water that surrounded the earth. All of that, they've done all of their homework, and they're in a higher pay grade than I am on those kinds of things, but I trust their judgment, and I think they've made a good case for that. Verse 5 then says, Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Notice, it's summarized here that he had possessions. How many possessions did he have? We're going to find out very quickly that he had a lot of possessions. Abram was a very wealthy individual. And notice also the persons which they had acquired. Abram had slaves. He had slaves working for him. Slavery in the Old Testament period, as we know, was very common, and it was the case here with Abram. So verse 6 then says, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The oak of Moreh is going to factor in later on in the text in chapter 35, verse 4. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, we see the oak of Moreh again described in Deuteronomy 11:36. So Moses is setting forth a marker, a geographical marker, something that the Israelites are familiar with. It'd be like us if we're telling somebody how to get to somebody's house and they're familiar with the area. We go down to old man Smith's place and hang a left. Well, this is what Moses is doing. You know the Oak of Moreh. Well, everybody would know what the Oak of Moreh is. And so those familiar landmarks is what he's referring to. Verse 7 then says, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. He built an altar. You're going to see this mentioned time after time after time in connection with Abram. Everywhere he goes and when he stops, with very few exceptions, he builds an altar. He builds an altar for the purpose of worshiping God. Abram is that kind of individual. Then he says in verse 8, he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Bethel is 10 miles north of Jerusalem, to give you an idea about the geography here. So you're talking 10 miles north of what would become Jerusalem. Jerusalem was not in existence at this point, obviously, even though we're going to be introduced to an individual who is from that area, which we will come across later in our study. But then he says Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Now, some people pronounce that Ai. Well, really, that's not how you pronounce it. You pronounce it I. I is going to figure prominently in the story of Israel later on. And so when the Israelite reads this, after Moses has written it, he knows exactly what Moses is talking about. You've got Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. I know where that is. The Israelite would say, yes, I know exactly where you're talking about. And then he says, there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. He worshiped. He worshiped. That was his habit. That was what Abram did everywhere he went. Then it says Abram journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. Negev is a desert region. It's a desert region where he was traveling. Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. This kind of incident would be very familiar to the Israelites as well. Periodic famines that would strike in the area. And where would the food be located? Down in Egypt, normally. That's going to factor in toward the end of the book of Genesis when you come to the story of Joseph. Joseph and all that happens with him as we come to that story. So, verse 11 says, it came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, see now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. Now you think about this for a minute. Abram was 75 years old. So Sarai was already 60 years old. And Abram states a truth that is legendary among the Israelites by the time Moses writes these words. Abram simply says, I know that you are a beautiful woman. Jewish writings talk about the legendary beauty of Sarah. How beautiful she was to look on. And you're going to see this factor into this. Not only here, but also later on. Sarah was a very beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you. Abram, the man of faith. Abram, the man to whom God made the promises. Abram's telling Sarai to lie. Well, it's a half-truth. Okay, it's a half-truth, but it's also a full lie. Well, the fact is, yes, in a sense, she's related to him, but not in the sense that Abram is saying. Now watch what happens. It came about when Abram came into Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. Again, in Jewish literature, the beauty of Sarai was legendary, and here Pharaoh recognizes it. This is the first mention to Pharaoh. The first time you see the word Pharaoh mentioned is right here. The word Pharaoh means great house. The Pharaohs had already been in Egypt for thousands of years prior to this. They had already been ensconced in the government of Egypt for many, many years. The pyramids of Egypt, the legendary pyramids, were already built. They were already there in Egypt by the time all these things take place. Some people think that the pyramids were built with Israelite labor. That's not the case. They did not build the pyramids. The pyramids were already there. They're already in Egypt by the time the Israelites are there during the period of the Exodus. But still, the pharaohs had already been in place. And this is the first time that we have mentioned the book of Genesis. Verse 16, therefore he treated Abram well for her sake, and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. You think about this. Pharaoh is giving Abram all of this livestock, all of this wealth for one woman. For one woman. Her beauty must have been something to see. Well, notice what happens. But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Notice what Moses does here. He not only says Sarai, he adds Abram's wife. He's stressing the mistake, the sin that Abram committed. Abram was a man just like we are. Abram had his flaws just like we have our flaws. The Hebrews writer talks about that in Hebrews 11. These were all great men and women of faith that he describes, but then he ends up that chapter in Hebrews 11 that the Lord's provided something better for us, that they without us might not be made perfect. In other words, we have it better in many ways than the people of old. And sometimes we look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses as all superheroes. Now, none of us can be like them. Oh, yes, we can. If we have the obedient faith that the Hebrews writer describes, we can be even better than them. Well, here we find Abram making a big mistake, and Pharaoh's house is paying for it. Verse 18 then says, Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here's your wife. Take her and go. He finds out. He finds out she's not your sister. She's your wife. All this has happened to us because of what you told. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away with his wife and all that belonged to him. He's saying, get out of here. Leave. Because you're bringing all this upon us. What you told is simply not true. Abram was guilty of a lack of trust in God's protection. As close a relationship as he had with God, when it came to matters of his physical family, that was a weakness. That was a weakness in the man. He was willing to do things that he would not normally do to protect his family. And that sometimes that factors in. Yes, sir.
But it says, so that I took her for my wife. Do you think, how far along do you think that had gotten? Do you think they actually had a ceremony? Do you think she actually was with them for a period of time?
That's a good question. We're not told by Moses how far this thing went. It seems to indicate, verse 17 seems to indicate that it was almost immediate when all these plagues happened. That Pharaoh had it in his mind that he was going to take her for wife. There may have been some kind of ceremony or a pre-ceremony. There may have been some kind of acknowledgement. We're not told. But at any rate, it was fairly quickly when all this happens. So in Pharaoh's mind, it's a done deal. I'm giving you all this, I'm taking her. And you know, when you're dealing with the most powerful ruler in the world at this point, which Pharaoh was, even someone like Abram is going to be intimidated. You know, if you've got a ruler there with all of his guards and all of his armies, and he's already conquered how much territory, and he says, I'm going to take her, what do you do? You know, Abram already knows something like that possibly would happen. Otherwise, he was trying to save her life and his, but he's not trusting in the Lord. So how far this thing went, Moses doesn't really tell us, but, at least in Pharaoh's mind, it was a done deal. Yes, sir.
It was customary in those days when they grew a certain wife that she would go in the harem and she went through a period of purification before back to having kind of a sexual relationship.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And in fact, you see something like that take place with Esther. When Esther was taken into the harem of Xerxes, and she goes through the purification process, and she esteems herself above all the other women in the harem. So that is a very common practice, absolutely, to purify the woman that has been taken before she is taken to wife, as far as the intimate relationship is concerned. Yes, sir. Yes. Right. Abram didn't take that opportunity. Moses doesn't tell us all of what was going through Abram's mind. We can only surmise. And I would surmise, as I mentioned earlier, that perhaps he was intimidated by Pharaoh, and he knew that he didn't have the firepower, for lack of a better term, to oppose Pharaoh. And so he was going to have to deal with it in his mind the best way he possibly could, without turning to the Lord. And how many times do we do that when we have problems? We think we can handle it all ourselves. And what happens when we try to handle it all ourselves? We mess it up, don't we? Well, normally that's the case. If we don't ask the Lord to help us in our problem, then, we're setting ourselves up for a big, big fall. And Abram made this mistake, and it's not going to be the last time he makes a mistake, by the way. And that's one beautiful thing about Moses in writing the book of Genesis. He doesn't gloss over the mistakes of all these great men and women. He's going to tell us in great detail, sometimes a little bit more detail than we would be comfortable with. But he's doing it for a reason. He's doing it for the reason of trying to emphasize to the Israelites who at this point are in the wilderness. While Moses is writing these words, they are in the wilderness and wandering, 40 years of wandering. He's writing these words through the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And the purpose of it, one of the big purposes, is to get Israel to focus on the fact that they've got to be holy. They've got to be a separate people. And the fact is, they can be. If Father Abraham was a great man of faith and he made these mistakes, and if all these men were great men of faith and they made all these big blunders, then how much more can we be great men and women of faith? That's what he's trying to get across to them. And if we look at it from that perspective, it becomes very clear. It becomes very clear what Moses is trying to do. And the lessons for us is, in our day and time, when we think, well, we can never be like the men and women of the Bible, oh, yes, we can. Oh, yes, we can. Because if they made their blunders and they were still accepted by God, we can make some blunders and still be accepted by God if we are faithful. That's the key. These men and women were faithful in spite of their mistakes. We can be faithful in spite of our mistakes and obedient. Any other questions, comments before we move on to chapter 13? All right. Yes, sir. There had to have been some kind of a conversation. Or else, even though Moses doesn't tell us explicitly, it could very well be that the Lord revealed it to Pharaoh in some way. In the same sense that he does later on with Isaac and Rebekah. Because Isaac does virtually the same thing with Rebekah. And what the Lord does at that occasion is he reveals directly to Pharaoh about what's going on. That could be the case, or it likely is, as you say, that somehow there was some sort of either an intentional conversation or something that was said when Sarah didn't think that he was listening. And he overhears it, and he says, he puts two and two together and says, that's the reason why all this is happening. So there had to have been something that was said for Pharaoh to know. I agree with you completely about that. Any other questions or comments before we move on? Chapter 13 says, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev. That's the south country. He and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Again, Lot's mentioned particularly here. Lot, Abram's nephew. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. See, he's already received all of these things from Pharaoh, and we're not told that he gave them back. We're not told that Pharaoh asked for it back. So he's got that, but he already had a lot of riches. He was already a wealthy man, and even more so now. Verse 3 tells us he went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. That's hearkening back to chapter 12, verse 10. Between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar where he had made there formerly. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Abram once again worships God. He worships everywhere he goes. He was faithful in that. That's a good example for us. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. So now you got a situation where Abram's got all of his wealth and his accumulation of riches, and Lot has done well for himself as well. He's got all of his riches, all of his flocks, and all of his herds and tents. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. Now get this in your head, this picture. You've got a caravan. You know, there's a lot talked about caravans these days. Well, in this sense, this is a good caravan. This is a typical caravan of the ancient world. You've got a caravan of people and of flocks and herds that are traveling. And it's a big, big undertaking when you've got Abram's stuff. And now you've got Lot's stuff on top of Abram's stuff. And it's beginning to be a big problem because the land couldn't sustain them. There was insufficient pasture for all of their livestock. There was insufficient water to sustain all of those animals. And then on top of that, verse 7 says, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling then in the land. So Moses is painting this picture for the Israelite as he's reading this. The Israelite reads these words and he recognizes this situation. He sees in his mind this picture of Abram's livestock and his flocks and Lot's flocks and livestock. And then on top of that, the herdsmen are having conflict back and forth. My master told me that I could go and feed my flocks. No, Lot told me I could do this. And you start having this big strife, conflict between the two groups. And on top of that, he says the Canaanite and the Perizzite were then dwelling in the land. And the Israelite reads this, and the Canaanites and Perizzites, we know about them. We're dealing with them even now. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, we're going to take this land, and yet they are in the land that we're trying to conquer. So on top of everything else, you've got all these indigenous peoples there in Canaan that are already settled. So there's a limited amount of space that's available for all of this. Verse 8, this is wonderful. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. I've got 2 exclamation points right by that statement, and it's underlined. The King James Version puts it, we be brethren. I like how the translators phrase that, we be brethren. J.D. Thomas, a longtime professor at Abilene Christian way back in the 50s, and 60s and 70s. Published a book, some of you may remember that book, about the non-institutional controversies, the anti-controversies at the time that were raging, entitled We Be Brethren, based on this passage, trying to call for peace and unity among brethren that otherwise would be united, and yet we're allowing these things of strife to come between us. Well, this attitude, this disposition that Abram manifests toward Lot is beautiful. It is a great spirit of unity. The psalmist would put it this way in Psalms 133, verse 1. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Unity. You know, look at your physical family for a moment. If you have enjoyed your relationship with your physical family all these years, you are in a great place. If you have unity in your physical family, that is a wonderful thing. There are many families that can't say that. There are many physical families at this very hour that have deep divisions, deep fissures that probably can't be healed. Some of them can be, but some of them can't be. And that's always a tragic thing. But if you have a family, if you've grown up in a family that is united and is on the same page, that is a wonderful thing, a beautiful thing to behold. And in God's spiritual family, such needs to exist. When a congregation is united on the truth of the Lord, and it's being led effectively, and the truth is being promoted, and the work of the Lord is being carried out, then you've got a wonderful thing going on. Because what the Lord prayed for in John 17 was unity among all believers. That they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee. That they all may be one in us, that the world may believe that thou hast sent me. Now the reality is, as we see from the book of Acts, that human beings get involved in the mix and they want to fracture things. By the time you come to Acts 15, you've got a situation that's threatening to kill the church before it even gets really big at all, because of the circumcision question. You've got brethren that are entering in trying to make laws for God already. So you've got human beings involved in the mix, and when human beings are involved in the mix, they're not always going to follow what the Lord said. I was at Freed Hardeman yesterday for a couple of reunions that I was involved with, late 80s reunion and Brigance Hall reunion. And in talking with some of my friends that I hadn't seen for a long time, we were catching up about where some of our old classmates and old dorm mates were. And it was unreal to find out where some of them had ended up. Some of them have completely left the church. One of them in particular wants nothing to do with Freed Hardeman anymore. He says he will not set foot on campus anymore. He was very involved when we were in school because of doctrinal issues. Because he's allowed these matters that he has really embraced fully to come into his thinking. And he set aside all of the good relationships that had been developed in those years and the great friendships and the great memories. He set aside all of that because he wants to hold on to these man-made doctrines. And that's not the only case. There are several others that we talked about that have similar things in their own mind and their own practice, where they have allowed these things to enter in, and it's fractured the beautiful spirit that once existed between all of us. And when that happens in the Lord's church, it's always tragic. It's always tragic. The ideal is for there to be unity among all believers. That's what the Lord prayed for. That's what He wanted and desired and still does. The reality is that human beings enter in and they fracture things. They mess things up. And we've got to do the best that we possibly can to maintain unity. And the spirit that Abram expresses right here is the key to having true unity. It's not what I want. It's what you want that matters. When you're dealing with matters of indifference, when you're dealing with matters of opinion, when you're dealing with matters of no consequence, then you've got to give up your preference for somebody else. Now, if it's a thus saith the Lord involved, if it's a matter of worship, if it's a matter of how we worship or the organization of the church, or who can take the lead in the worship and the work of the church, or the plan of salvation, those matters, those are non-negotiable. We can't negotiate. We can't compromise on those things. But when it's matters of no consequence, matters of opinion, matters that have nothing to do with our soul salvation, hey, I'm going to give up my preference every single time. If the majority of the congregation wants it this way and it's not a matter of faith, if the elders say it's fine, then I'm fine with it. That's the way the attitude should be in the church of our Lord. And this attitude, this disposition is what Abram possesses. Notice verse 9. He says, "Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I will go to the left." Yes, sir. Right. Yeah, the thing is, he's supposed to leave his family, his kindred, and yet he's taking Lot with him. So he obeyed the Lord, but yet he had so much of a family tie with Lot that it becomes a problem. That family tie, that's going to be an ongoing issue for Abram to deal with, as we will see. And here Lot deals with it the best way he possibly can. And he's telling Lot, it's your choice. You take the choice. Isn't that beautiful? You take the choice. Whatever you take, I'll take the opposite. And so verse 10 then says, Lot lifted up his eyes. Lifted up his eyes. He lifted up his eyes. What does the Bible say? The ways that Satan tempts us, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. He lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. So he and Abram were on a mountain, the way this implies to me at least. They're at a point where they could see for a great distance. So he's able to view all of this. And he's able to see this land. And Lot pinpoints that. Oh, yes, that land is very fertile. Land is very beautiful. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. So Lot chose the valley of the Jordan. Now, if you remember in your memory of geography, the Jordan River, of course, is right there in the midst of Canaan. And now we know that the Dead Sea is there on the southern end of the Jordan River. It has been speculated, I think with good reason, that at least part of the Dead Sea is the valley that we're having described here. In other words, that when Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed by the fire and the brimstone and all of what the Lord sends upon it, that it causes the Dead Sea to form. Very possible. At the very least, the southern tip of the Dead Sea is what is speculated by many to be the part of the land that Lot had chosen, at least part of it, where Sodom and Gomorrah was located, no question. So that gives you an idea of the location that we're talking about. So verse 12 says, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley, and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Again, I like how the King James puts it. He pitched his tent toward Sodom. There's a sermon that I have preached in the past, that my dad has preached in the past, called Lot Pitched His Tent Toward Sodom. Mr. and Mrs. Lot allowed Sodom to get hold of their family. And it started by pitching his tent toward Sodom. How many times have you seen members of the Lord's church that started out fine and yet they started to pitch their tent toward Sodom? In the sense they began to compromise with what the world was offering. They began to say, oh, this is okay, and this is all right, and this looks okay, and they start moving further and further and further, closer and closer to the center of where all of that sin, that evil is. That's what Lot was doing. He was pitching his tent, moving his tents in the direction of Sodom, as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly. and sinners against the Lord. Moses puts forth a foreshadowing. This is foreshadowing. He tells us, by the way, the men of Sodom, they're wicked. They're sinners. And of course, we normally associate the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah with the sin of homosexuality, and that was part of it. But Ezekiel tells us in his prophetic book that there was more than just that. There were a lot of sins that the men of Sodom were committing, aside from the sexual aspect. There were a lot of things that they were doing. Injustice against their neighbors, and all sorts of things that were going on that were contributing to the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah. So here already, Lot is going in the direction of a city that's distinguished itself as being evil. And Lot would pay the price. We're going to see that. Lot's going to pay the price. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever." So when Lot leaves and all of his people leave and all of his herds leave, the Lord repeats his promise to Abram. Look all the way around you. Look all the way around you. All this is yours. All of this. And not only is it going to be for you, it's going to be for your descendants. And now the Lord tells him, to your descendants forever. And a lot of our religious friends get all excited about this today and say, you see, Israel's got this land. They have the right to it. It's to them forever. Well, no. Because it was conditional. It was conditional on their faithfulness. Moses is going to make that crystal clear in the book of Deuteronomy. When they're about to enter into the land, what does Moses tell the Israelites? What is it that he says to them? If you're faithful, the Lord will bless you. The Lord will give you all of this. But if you disobey the word of the Lord, you know what's going to happen? There's going to be people that's going to come in and take you away to lands that you did not know. Take away all of this. So this is conditional. This is a promise that was made to Abram on condition of his faithfulness and on condition of his descendants' faithfulness. Today, the so-called state of Israel has no biblical right to claim that land. Now, they do have political right. I affirm they have political right to do it. And there's a strategic interest on the part of the United States to support them in light of everything that's around. But as far as basing it on the Bible and saying that they've got a right to this, no, they don't. Not anymore. Not anymore. Those promises were fulfilled. The land promise was fulfilled. The spiritual promise was fulfilled. So our religious neighbors that claim that they've got some sort of biblical basis to having that land, no, not really. Not when you really look what the Bible says. So, he says in verse 16, I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, and your descendants can also be numbered. We see this repeated in chapter 13, verse 16. We also see two New Testament books mention this. Romans 4:16, Paul mentions it, and Hebrews 11:12, the Hebrews writer mentions it. Your descendants will be as the dust of the earth, as the sands of the seashore. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. He's promising this to Abram. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. Hebron is 19 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It is the highest point in that area. And so there he dwells. And it says, there he built an altar to the Lord. Again, Abram builds an altar. Everywhere he goes, he builds an altar. Everywhere he goes, he worships God. Can that be said about us? Do we leave our mark wherever we go in a positive way? That's something we've got to make sure that we do. Well, this is